Chapter 8 Statement of the Questions. Although until recently the Church was closely linked to the established order, it is beginning to take a different attitude regarding the exploitation, oppression, and alienation which prevails in Latin America. This has caused concern among the beneficiaries and defenders of capitalist society, who no longer can depend on what used to be, whether consciously or unconsciously, one of their mainstays. This concern is reflected, for example, in the Rockefeller Report. After asserting that the Church has become a force dedicated to change, revolutionary change if necessary, it notes apprehensively and patronizingly that the Church may be somewhat in the same situation as the young, with a profound idealism, but as a result, in some cases, vulnerable to subversive penetration. Ready to undertake a revolution if necessary to end injustice, but not clear either as to the ultimate nature of the revolution itself, or as to the governmental system by which this justice it seeks can be realized. Certain groups within the Church, as we have noted above, are beginning to be regarded as subversive and are even being harshly repressed. All this creates for the Latin American Church a completely new situation and forces it to face problems for which the Church, and especially ecclesiastical authority, is poorly prepared. The daily events in the life of the Church, writes Cesar Aguiar, go far beyond the expectations of the ordinary Christian. 5 years ago, who would have thought that in our continent priests would be murdered, Christians persecuted, priests deported, the Catholic press silenced and attacked, ecclesiastical premises searched, and so forth? Probably nobody. 5 years ago, even the most radical Christians viewed events through utopian lenses and did not grasp their dramatic historical implications. During the last 3 years, written statements, more moderate than the concrete commitments of many Christians, have multiplied. Many of them are endowed with great doctrinal authority. There is, however, a dangerous disproportion between what is asserted and called for in these documents and the attitudes of the greater part of the Latin American Church. This is particularly serious for a church which claims to live according to a truth which is done. Nevertheless, the commitments of Christians in Latin America and the texts which attempt to explicate them are gradually fashioning an authentic political option of the Church on this continent. Many of these actions are ambiguous, romantic, or careless, but this must not distract us from their fundamental direction. It is true that this option is not that of the majority of the Latin American Christian community. It is, however, the option of its most dynamic sectors, which have a growing influence and a promising future. As a whole, the Church in the past has reflected, and indeed still reflects, the ideology of the dominant groups in Latin America. This is what has begun to change. In this context, we must include the Medellin Conference as a major event. At Medellin, the Latin American Church, despite the climate created by the Eucharistic Congress held in Bogota immediately before it, realistically perceived the world in which it was and clearly saw its place in that world. In short, it began to be aware of its own coming of age and to take the reins of its own destiny. Vatican II speaks of the underdevelopment of peoples, of the developed countries, and what they can do and should do about this underdevelopment. Medellin tries to deal with the problem from the standpoint of the poor countries, characterizing them as subjected to a new kind of colonialism. Vatican II talks about a church in the world and describes the relationship in a way which tends to neutralize the conflicts. Medellin demonstrates that the world in which the Latin American Church ought to be present is in full revolution. Vatican II sketches a general outline for church renewal. Medellin provides guidelines for a transformation of the Church in terms of its presence on a continent of misery and injustice. Medellin, despite its imperfections and lacunae, legitimates newly created phenomena in the Latin American Church. Efforts at renewal now, therefore, enjoy unexpected support. Above all, Medellin provides an impulse for new commitments. But the Christian community in Latin America is now living in a post-Medellin period, which, like the post-conciliar era, is characterized by dwelling on many of the old questions. There is, however, a new and sharper awareness of these questions. In the post-Medellin period, as in the post-conciliar one, some groups would like the surprising consequences of positions they took to be forgotten or mitigated. They cannot contradict the letter of what was said, so they try to declare it inapplicable, valid only for special and carefully defined situations. This effort attempts to devalue not only the authority of Medellin, but the spirit which it engendered. It is a useless exercise. If and when it should be accomplished, the Medellin texts will be obsolete. We will be facing a completely new situation. Rather than desperately try to protect these statements from erroneous or deliberately exaggerated interpretations, therefore, it is important to work out their exegesis in concrete reality. Their validity will be confirmed in the praxis of the Christian community. Only in this way will they have gospel freshness and permanent historical validity. Here we shall gather under various headings the more important theologico-pastoral questions posed by this new situation. They will be the basis for the rest of the book. A. The options which Christians in Latin America are taking have brought a fundamental question to the fore. What is the meaning of the faith in a life committed to the struggle against injustice and alienation? How do we relate the work of building a just society to the absolute value of the kingdom? For many, the participation in the process of liberation causes a wearying, anguished, long, and unbearable dichotomy between their life of faith and their revolutionary commitment. What is called for is not to accuse them of confusing the kingdom with revolution, only because they take the latter seriously and because they believe that the kingdom is incompatible with the present unjust situation, and that in Latin America the coming of the kingdom presupposes the breaking up of this state of affairs. These accusations often come from those who are comfortably established in a very safe religious life. Rather, what is called for is to search out theological responses to the problems which arise in the life of a Christian who has chosen for the oppressed and against the oppressors. Moreover, the close collaboration with people of different spiritual outlooks, which this option provides, leads one to ponder the contribution proper to the faith. This question must be carefully considered in order to avoid the petty ambition of having more. B. The problem, however, is not only to find a new theological framework. The personal and community prayer of many Christians committed to the process of liberation is undergoing a serious crisis. This could purify prayer life of childish attitudes, routine, and escapes, but it will not do if new paths are not broken and new spiritual experiences are not lived. For example, without contemplative life, to use a traditional term, there is no authentic Christian life. Yet what this contemplative life will be is still unknown. There is great need for a spirituality of liberation. Yet in Latin America, those who have opted to participate in the process of liberation, as we have outlined it above, comprise, in a manner of speaking, a first Christian generation. In many areas of their life, they are without a theological and spiritual tradition. They are creating their own. C. The Latin American reality, the historical moment which Latin America is experiencing, is deeply conflictual. One of Medellin's great merits is to have been rooted in this reality and to have expressed it in terms surprisingly clear and accessible for an ecclesiastical document. Medellin marks the beginning of a new relationship between theological and pastoral language on the one hand, and the social sciences which seek to interpret this reality on the other. This relationship gives rise to statements which are to a large extent contingent and provisional. This is the price one must pay for being incisive and contemporary and for expressing the word today in our everyday words. But this language is only a reflection of a deeper process, a new awareness. The commitments and statements referred to in the two preceding chapters are placing us face to face with a new social experience of Latin Americans and with new directions that the Christian community is beginning to take. It is important to be aware of the newness of this phenomenon. It implies a different, very concrete way of looking at the historical process, that is, of perceiving the presence of the Lord in history, who encourages us to be artisans of this process. Moreover, because of close contact with those who see historical development from a Marxist viewpoint, we are led to review and revitalize the eschatological values of Christianity, which stress not only the provisional nature of historical accomplishments, but above all their openness towards the total communion of all human beings with God. We Christians, however, are not used to thinking in conflictual and historical terms. We prefer peaceful conciliation to antagonism and an evasive eternity to a provisional arrangement. We must learn to live and think of peace in conflict and of what is definitive in what is historical. Very important in this regard are collaboration and dialogue with those who, from different vantage points, are also struggling for the liberation of oppressed peoples. At stake is the meaning of Christian participation in this liberation. D. The Latin American Church is sharply divided with regard to the process of liberation. Living in a capitalist society in which one class confronts another, the Church, in the measure that its presence increases, cannot escape nor try to ignore any longer the profound division among its members. Active participation in the liberation process is far from being a uniform position of the Latin American Christian community. The majority of the Church continues to be linked in many different ways to the established order. And what is worse, among Latin American Christians, there are not only different political options within a framework of free interplay of ideas. The polarization of these options and the extreme seriousness of the situation have even placed some Christians among the oppressed and persecuted, and others among the oppressors and persecutors, some among the tortured and others among the torturers or those who condone torture. This gives rise to a serious and radical confrontation between Christians who suffer from injustice and exploitation and those who benefit from the established order. Under such circumstances, life in the contemporary Christian community becomes particularly difficult and conflictual. Participation in the Eucharist, for example, as it is celebrated today, appears to many to be an action which, for want of the support of an authentic community, becomes an exercise in make-believe. From now on, it is impossible not to face the problems which arise from this division between Christians, which has reached such dramatic proportions. Clarion calls to Christian unity which do not take into account the deep causes of present conditions, and the real prerequisites for building a just society are merely escapist. We are moving towards a new idea of unity and communion in the Church. Unity is not an event accomplished once and for all, but something which is always in the process of becoming, something which is achieved with courage and freedom of spirit, sometimes at the price of painful, heart-rending decisions. Latin America must brace itself for such experiences. E. In Latin America, the Church must place itself squarely within the process of revolution, amid the violence which is present in different ways. The Church's mission is defined practically and theoretically, pastorally and theologically, in relation to this revolutionary process. That is, its mission is defined more by the political context than by intra-ecclesiastical problems. Its greatest omission would be to turn in upon itself. Because of the options which, with the qualifications we have indicated, the Christian community is making, it is faced ever more clearly with the dilemma now confronting the whole continent: to be for or against the system, or more subtly, to be for reform or revolution. Many Christians have resolutely decided for the difficult path which leads to the latter, Confronted with this polarization, can ecclesiastical authority remain on the level of general statements? On the other hand, can it go beyond them and still remain within what is traditionally considered to be its specific mission? For the Latin American Church, it is becoming increasingly clearer that to be in the world without being of the world means concretely to be in the system without being of the system. It is evident that only a break with the unjust order and a frank commitment to a new society can make the message of love which the Christian community bears credible to Latin Americans. These demands should lead the Church to a profound revision of its manner of preaching the Word and of living and celebrating its faith. F. Closely connected with this problem is another very controversial question. Should the Church put its social weight behind social transformation in Latin America? Some are worried that it would be a mistake for the Church to attempt to achieve the necessary and urgent changes. The fear is that the Church will become linked to the future established order, albeit a more just one. There is also a fear that an effort in this direction will end in a noisy failure. The Latin American bishops are not all of one mind and do not have the necessary means at their disposal to orientate Christians as a whole toward social progress. The relevance of these fears cannot be denied. There is indeed great risk. But the social influence of the Church is a fact. Not to exercise this influence in favor of the oppressed of Latin America is really to exercise it against them, and it is difficult to determine beforehand the consequences of this action. Not to speak is in fact to become another kind of church of silence, silence in the face of the despoliation and exploitation of the weak by the powerful. On the other hand, would not the best way for the Church to break its links with the existing order and in the process lose its ambiguous social prestige be precisely to denounce the fundamental injustice upon which this order is based? Often the Church alone is in a position publicly to raise its voice and its protest. When some churches have attempted to do this, they have been harassed by the dominant groups and repressed by political power. In order to reflect on what action the Latin American Church should take and to act accordingly, it is necessary to consider its historical and social coordinates, its here and now. To neglect doing this is to remain on an abstract and a historical theological level, or perhaps more subtly, it is to remain on the level of a theology more concerned with avoiding past errors than with discovering the originality of the present situation and committing itself to tomorrow. G. The Latin American community lives on a poor continent, but the image it projects is not, as a whole, that of a poor church. The conclusions of Medellin accurately acknowledge this fact, which can be verified by anyone who takes the time to get to know the impression of the average Latin American. Prejudices and generalizations undoubtedly distort the image, but no one can deny its fundamental validity. The majority of the Church has covertly or openly been an accomplice of the external and internal dependency of our peoples. It has sided with the dominant groups, and in the name of efficacy has dedicated its best efforts to them. It has identified with these sectors and adopted their style of life. We often confuse the possession of basic necessities with a comfortable position in the world, freedom to preach the gospel with protection by powerful groups, instruments of service with the means of power. It is nevertheless important to clarify exactly what the witness of poverty involves. Despite the hopes aroused by the options we have mentioned, many Christians in Latin America regard them very skeptically. They think that these choices have opened up too late and that real changes in the Church will result only from the social transformations which the whole continent is undergoing. Many even fear, as do many non-Christians, that the efforts of the Latin American Church will only make it the Latin American version of de Lampedusa's leopard. This danger is real and we must be aware of it, in any case by confronting the problems facing it, With all their peculiar characteristics, the Latin American Church ought to be gradually asserting its own personality. The situation of dependency which pervades the continent is also present in the ecclesiastical realm. The Latin American Church was born dependent and still remains in circumstances which have prevented it from developing its peculiar gifts. As on the socioeconomic and political levels, this dependency is not only an external factor. It molds the structures, life, and thought of the Latin American Church, which has been more a church reflection than a church source. This is another of the repeated complaints of laypersons, priests, religious, and bishops in Latin America. Overcoming the colonial mentality is one of the important tasks of the Christian community. In this way, it will be able to make a genuine contribution to the enrichment of the universal church. It will be able to face its real problems and to sink deep roots into a continent in revolution.